All right, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. In this video, I want to go through a little introduction to RStudio, which is a separate software that we can use to program in R and create documents similar to the documents we were working with in Google Colab. So I want to first just make sure everybody is comfortable switching over to RStudio, knows how to work with RStudio and where to find the files in RStudio. So the very first question you might be asking is, why am I switching us over to RStudio this week from using Google Colab, which we've been doing in prior weeks? And the reason is this week and in next week, we're going to be working with interactive graphics, which do not display when we're working in Google Colaboratory. So we're going to be coding in R using very, very similar documents. We're just going to be editing them using a different form of software. That software is totally free and totally available through a cloud, so you don't need to install anything onto your computer, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the main point here is whether we're using RStudio or Google Colaboratory or some other form of software, the main goal when you're learning programming and coding is that you want to become proficient and fluent so that it doesn't matter what software or interface you're using. That really becomes irrelevant. So we want to build our coding skills so that we can transfer that knowledge over to just about any workflow on any software system. And so any of the logic or the techniques that we learn, say in a class in R, even beyond the software, we should be able to transfer the techniques that we learn programming in R over to programming in other languages like Python or Julia or something else. So the goal is not to get really rigid in that I only know how to code in one language and in one software, but I'm so comfortable coding in R in Colab that now moving this over into RStudio, no big deal. I can transfer these skills and figure out how to code in Python or some other language much faster. So we're going to be switching over into RStudio this week, and the reason again is because we're going to be using interactive graphics. So the question that you might be thinking is, well, what is better? Should I be using RStudio? Should I be using Google Colaboratory? This is a very deep question. It's a very subjective question, and different people are going to prefer different things, right? Just like some people love Vegemite, particularly if you live in Australia. Most people who don't live in Australia think it's disgusting. It's totally subjective. It really depends on your taste. Same goes for RStudio and Colab. It really depends on your taste. But for our purposes, what's similar about them is that they both are open source. They're free. They both have cloud-based versions. You don't need to install anything onto your computer to use RStudio. They both work with two types of cells, text and code cells. So that's going to be very similar. And the way that we format text in working with these documents in RStudio is going to be using Markdown, which is the same exact way that we've been formatting text in a Colab notebook, in a Jupyter notebook. And both RStudio and Colab, we can change the underlying programming language so that we can work in RStudio with Python or other programming languages just like we can in Colab. So why would I want to use Colab instead of RStudio as we have been doing so far this semester? Colab is just super nice from my point of view for teaching and learning coding because you don't need to install anything. You just open up a Colab notebook and you can see everything self-contained in that website. As well, there's really nice file sharing capability with Google Drive. People tend to be a little more familiar working with Google products. They're super stable. So there's some nice pros to working with Google Colaboratory that we've been taking advantage of. And when you're working in Google Colab, you're working with what are called Jupyter notebooks, interactive Jupyter notebooks. So that's the file type that you're working with. And Jupyter notebooks are kind of like the industry-wide standard in some sense when you're creating documents that are weaving together code and other forms of media. So that's a good reason to use Colab. Why are we switching over to RStudio for this week? Well, all of the same benefits of Colab are there. It's free. There's a cloud version, so you don't need to install anything. The Google in RStudio, you can certainly work with Jupyter notebooks. So you can work with the same file types that we're working with in Colab. This week, we're going to be working with what are called Quarto documents. So it's an analog to Jupyter Notebook, and you'll learn about that as we edit those files. But what's really, really nice about working in RStudio is packages are way easier to manage in RStudio than they are in Google Colab. We'll see how that works. Um, it's easier to work with files that are locally on your computer with Colab. It's a little more natural to just use files that are in the drive. And if you have files that are on your desktop, it's really easiest to move those files into the drive before you access them. That's not an issue with RStudio. It's going to work super nice if we have data stored at any location on our computer. We'll be able to find it. And for our purposes right now, RStudio, we can create interactive graphics. And we're going to do that this week using a package called Plotly. So before we get going working with Plotly, I want to make sure that everybody first is comfortable working in RStudio and is able to find the files that we're going to be working with in RStudio. So that's a quick introduction to RStudio and Colab. In the next video, I'll explain all of the various ingredients that go into working with these documents in RStudio instead of working in Colab. Okay, thanks everyone.